Thank you, everybody, for coming. My name is James Quall. I'm president of TICAS, Institute for College Access and Success. I want to thank also our hosts, majority Rick Clyburn and Renard Bloomfield, for getting us this space. We at TICAS have been working on Pell Grants for more than a decade. We think that they are fundamentally important for closing disparities by income and by race in college attainment. Unfortunately, while many of us have worked to increase Pell Grants in recent years, they continue to fall further behind the actual cost of college. At community colleges, for example, the cost of attending has gone up by $2,200 since the year 2000, but Pell Grants have only gone up by $1,000. And at four-year publics, Pell Grant falls more than $3,000 behind where it was in 2000. The result of inadequate Pell funding, there are two impacts. The first is that many students can't afford college, and there's a long line of research showing that scholarship spending has a substantial impact on students' decision to enroll. Others who do enroll suffer deprivations, and we've learned a lot in recent years about students who go hungry or who are homeless. And others take on jobs, sometimes full-time jobs, go to school part-time. And in fact, the most common reason that students give for failing to complete is that they ran out. The second major impact is that it contributes to the crisis in student debt. And we have 1 million students a year who default. Many of them are Pell Grant recipients. In fact, a Pell Grant recipient is 3 times more likely to default than other students. And we know that in many cases, these defaulters are the same people who struggle to afford college in the first place, disproportionately low income and disproportionately students of color. One projection is that eventually 70% of Black student borrowers will default. So Pell remains an essential part of federal policy toward higher education, but improvements are needed for it to achieve its job. Today we have a panel of experts, including students and policy analysts, who are going to talk about how we can get Pell the funding that it needs and what mechanisms exist to assure that funding. And we're also going to talk about proposals to expand eligibility for Pell, including to undocumented students, to incarcerated students, and to students enrolled in very short-term training programs. But before we turn it over to the panel, we have 2 true experts who are 2 students who have relied on Pell Grants in order to finance their education. So I'm just going to introduce them both quickly now, and then they'll come up one at a time and quickly tell their stories. The first, immediately to my right, is Cynthia Celestin. She is the class of 2020 at George Mason University, where she's studying psychology and public policy and management. She will probably be a better public speaker than I am because she is an old hat at Hill briefings and Hill testimony. And at George Mason, she is the president of First Gen Mason, and she's also an Access College Foundation scholarship recipient. To her right is Bennett Lund. Bennett is also a rising senior. He is at the University of South Carolina Honors College, where he's studying jurisprudence and education policy. He has worked at the university as an advocate for students through his roles as a resident mentor and as secretary of student academics, where he developed new programs to complement the student advising process. He's worked at the South Carolina Senate Judiciary Committee, the South Carolina State Grand Jury, the Rule of Law Collaborative, and the Office of Majority Rick Clyburn. He is a 2019 Truman Scholar, and he's currently interning at TICAS. Perhaps most impressive of all. So with that, Cynthia.
Students like me, who are underrepresented minorities, children of immigrants, low socioeconomic background, and first generation, are fighting for a degree that will bring honor and hope to our families. We are reaching for new heights with the knowledge that we must run with this opportunity for those who came before us and for those who will come behind us. But access without support is simply not real opportunity. Like many of my peers, the biggest challenge I have faced is figuring out how I will pay for college. As a senior in high school, I never heard of Pell EFC, or the FAFSA. I'm fortunate to be a scholarship recipient of the Access College Foundation, a member of the National College Access Network. I was assigned an Access advisor in high school that explained all of those things to me. He even set up me and my mother's FSA ID account to complete the FAFSA. I also had access to application waivers, and I was able to easily get in contact with my advisor whenever I needed to. When applying to colleges, I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't know what questions to ask. I was in AP and dual enrollment courses with students who knew that they were going to college, so I followed what they did. I achieved the same GPA, I applied to the same schools, and I took my SATs at the same time. I refused to get behind. I wanted access to the same opportunities I knew they would get. My advisor set up an appointment time for me to complete my FAFSA with him, but it was a few days after the FAFSA application opened. And I was scared that I wouldn't receive as much aid as my peers if I didn't do it the day it opened. So I did it on my own, which I can say remains to be one of the worst decisions I've ever made in my life. I was flagged for FAFSA verification, but I didn't know that I was flagged until August, the summer after I graduated high school. After I received an email from FSA saying that I submitted my FAFSA application, I assumed I was done and didn't need to check on anything until school started again. I vividly remember being on the phone, waiting and praying for someone from the IRS to just pick up. It took days until I reached someone after giving up for being on hold for so long. There was no way I could go to college without Pell Grants. Even with the several scholarships I received, I could not afford tuition alone. I remember being in the car with my mom, listening to her comfort me, saying that it was okay if I missed a year of school and that I could go to community college or apply again later. It was heartbreaking to hear that all my hard work was going to be a waste because I couldn't get through verification. Fortunately, the IRS picked up the phone, and I am extremely grateful to say that everything was fixed and submitted in time before my classes started. I thought my struggle ended then, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I had an EFC of 0, and I received the maximum Pell Grant available. I assumed this meant that I wouldn't have to take any loans, including Stafford loans, but when I found out that that was not the case, it changed everything. Coming from a low-income family, the idea of having any loans in my name freaked me out because I knew that eventually I had to pay those loans back, and I couldn't imagine where that money would come from. My mother was already working 12-hour shifts day after day to keep our family afloat, so I knew I could never ask her for money. I started working my first job in college after the second week of classes and never stopped working since. Financial stress made it hard for me to focus on my studying. The cost of this degree wasn't just a burden on me, but my entire family. I became a resident advisor my sophomore year and did that for 2 years, so my housing was covered and I received a stipend for my meal plan. Every extra dollar counts. With my job as a resident advisor and the increase in Pell this past year, I was able to receive reimbursement checks after taking out my federal loans. This made a huge difference in my experience at George Mason. It made the difference in whether I was able to get my required textbooks, to put gas in my car, to pay for a required parking pass, or to travel to my internship. An increase in Pell makes a difference in my livelihood and success as a student. Thank you.
Really quick, folks are sitting in the back. Would you all like to come to some of the chairs here?
Well, before I start, I wanted to thank TICAS for the opportunity to share my story today and to support the Pell Grant program. It's difficult to exaggerate the significance that the Pell Grant program has had for me and my family. See, I actually grew up feeling fairly financially secure. My family was middle class and comfortable. We knew college would be expensive, but we figured with some help from the family, scholarships, and maybe a few loans, we'd be able to cover it. In my junior year, however, my family's financial circumstances took a turn for the worse when the company my father worked for folded. Now, he had done a lot of planning and saving, and we probably would have been fine. But then, in my senior year, my father was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder called neuromyelitis optica. It's similar to MS, and it left him hospitalized for roughly over a month. While I'm very fortunate to say that my father is okay and has recovered in a lot of ways, the medical expenses associated with his illness have been financially crippling for my family. The brunt of them hit us while I was applying for school, and I quickly realized that if I wanted to go to college, I'd be paying for it myself. I knew that going to any other school besides the University of South Carolina was out of the question. South Carolina offers substantial merit scholarships, and it would have been foolish not to accept those. But I was still short something like 20 grand from our expected first year expenses. So while my dad was in the hospital, I was busy researching different scholarships I could apply to. By the end of the year, I had a spreadsheet consisting of about 40, and I had applied for roughly 20 of them. I'm fortunate to have gotten a few of those, but even with the other funding I received, the cost of college is going to be extremely limited. As a low-income student, financial calculations are always in the back of your head. You have the typical fiasco all students experience of trying to fill out the Fafsa, trying to navigate your school's payment website, trying to figure out why the university is calling your loan a financial aid award. But as a low-income student, you're also asking yourself, what's the most cost-effective way to spend my time? Should I do that volunteer work I wanted to do, or take this unpaid internship that's good for my career trajectory? Or should I work at Bed Bath & Beyond and pay my rent? Should I go work and live in Washington, D.C. like I've always dreamed of? Or should I go home so I can help my family make ends meet? The Pell Grant has eased these calculations, and I've been able to accept so many more opportunities than I would have without it. I literally would not be in front of you right now without it. We have this expectation of students to do what they can to better themselves and to go on and improve their lot in life. And I promise, students want to do just that. But for a lot of us, without programs like the Pell Grant, financial insecurity stands in the way. You know, one of the few good memories I have from when my dad was in the hospital was the night I got my acceptance letter to South Carolina's Honors College. I brought it to show my dad, and he's this big burly guy, kind of looks like a lumberjack. And I told him I got it, and he started to tear up. And in that moment, I realized that education is so much more than a few classes or tuition or the first year experience. It's hope. And not just for students, but for their families too. Even when we were in this terrible situation, the thought of the opportunities that my education might open up filled my father with hope. The Pell program, by allowing students like us the opportunity to pursue our education, is allowing us and our families to pursue hope. When you go back to your offices and you're helping make decisions that impact student aid, please remember that. It's not just about the return on investment. It's not just about students being able to take out a little less in student loans. It's about giving people hope, and every dollar counts. Thank you.
All right, now I'm going to introduce our moderator, and she's going to introduce the rest of the panel. Jocelyn Garcia is president of the United States Student Association, which is the oldest and largest advocacy organization on behalf of students. She also works with Emerald Cities Collaborative and a Community Learning Partnership. She is the daughter of Mexican and Guatemalan immigrants and a first-generation alumna of the University of California at Santa Barbara. As a student, she led multiple campaigns on behalf of students and served as student advocate general, where she led a successful historic campaign for the Latino community to demand increases in retention of their community on campus, including the establishment of a Central American department and major Latinx parent weekend and a campus mural celebrating the Latinx community. In her role as USSA president, she continues to fight for students on the national level by uplifting local community efforts on a national platform. She also served as the student representative on the Department of Education negotiated rulemaking committee for our.
Thank you. Buenos tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. Are y'all here? Yeah. Okay. I know it's like mid-afternoon and the energy tends to go a little low right now, so hopefully let's keep the energy up. Thank you all so much for sharing your student testimonies and also TICAS for providing this important conversation to take place. A lot of the students' testimonies that were just shared definitely resonate with my own personal story. As y'all heard, my parents are Mexican and Guatemalan immigrants. I was a first generation student, and a lot of the struggles of trying to figure out what Pell is, also what financial aid is, and the fact that it's not enough just to have good grades and good test scores is a really real struggle that a lot of individuals face. And at the end of the day, education is about creating opportunities for the future of this country, and I really hope that we center that with our conversation today and brainstorming what are ways to increase access and affordability of our education instead of limiting and creating more barriers for students who want to have access to education, who want to contribute to this country and the world in really positive ways. And the Pell Grant is one of those very essential tools to be able to do that. So without further ado, I'm gonna quickly introduce our panelists who will go into a further introduction and go into a lot of their expertise. So right next to me, I have Neha Dolo, who will be going over the Pell funding landscape. And next to her, I have Carrie Warwick, who will be going over Fafsa and verification simplification. And then next, we have Julie Njipia, who will be specifically going over Pell Grants for those who have been incarcerated in other marginalized communities. And then at the end, we have Amy Latino, who has a very Latin energy. We'll be going over lowering existing standards for institutional Pell eligibility. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to them, and then near the end, we'll have some opportunity for some Q&A. Y'all ready?
Yeah. Great, thank you for the introduction. So I just wanted to start with a simple question. How many people here either received a Pell Grant or know someone who did? Just throw up your hands. All right, so as is very obvious, even just from this room, the Pell Grant is the cornerstone of federal financial aid. It's essential for college affordability and equity, but to maintain its promise going forward, there are 6 critical steps that we need to take to both secure and strengthen the Pell Grant, and that's what I'm just going to talk about in the next several minutes. So today there's 7.5 million Americans who depend on the Pell Grant to both attend and complete college. Research tells us that need-based grant aid programs like the Pell Grant, they both improve enrollment and completion rates for low and moderate income students. So indeed, when you look at the folks who are actually receiving Pell Grants, most of them come from families whose incomes are $40,000 or less. And actually, the median family income of Pell Grant recipients has actually been declining over time. So Pell Grant recipients are already more than twice as likely as their higher income peers to have to take out a federal student loan. 8 out of 10 Pell Grant graduates from 4-year colleges have a federal student loan, and they will owe an average of $4,500 more than their higher income peers. Pell Grants are especially essential for closing equity gaps. Almost half of Hispanic and Latinx students, undergraduates, have a Pell Grant, as do almost 60% of Black undergraduates. So the Pell Grant is really opening the doors of access for many of us, as we saw in this room, but also, closing a lot of these equity gaps as well. Unfortunately, this year's maximum Pell Grant award covers the lowest share of college costs in the program's history. So if you go back to the 1980s, and those of you who picked up a fact sheet from the back, here's a nice little graphic of this. So in the 1980s, the maximum Pell Grant award covered over half of the average cost of a public 4-year school. But since then, there have been decades of underinvestment in the program, and Pell Grants have basically failed to keep up with rising college costs. And today, the maximum Pell Grant award is about $6,095, and it only covers 28% of the costs. So this brings me to the first critical recommendation that we really want to share today, is that we need to commit to a path to doubling the current maximum Pell Grant so that it covers roughly half of the 4-year public college cost of attendance. But a one-time increase is not sufficient because, as we know, inflation erodes the purchasing power of the Pell Grant every single year. So to counter this, the Pell Grant used to be tied to inflation, but this provision sunsetted after the 2017 to 18 award year. And in more recent years, we've seen appropriators, they've stepped up to fill some of the gaps. So for instance, just last week, the House passed a minibus that includes a $150 increase to the maximum Pell Grant award. And if the Senate follows suit, this will be the third consecutive year where appropriators have stepped up, played this critical role in making sure that the maximum Pell Grant increases by approximately the rate of inflation. Now, they've been able to do this by tapping into the Pell Reserve Fund, but they may not always be able to do this going forward. So you really need a more long-term solution, which brings us to the second key recommendation, which is to permanently restore the Pell Grant's automatic annual inflation adjustment. So these first two recommendations, increasing the maximum Pell Grant award, going towards the path of doubling it and tying it to inflation, these are really hugely critical, important steps to securing and improving the Pell Grant, but there are a few other recommendations that should be taken as well. So our third recommendation is to restore Pell Grant eligibility for students whose federal loans are discharged due to fraud. This would ensure that these students are not punished for the wrong things that their school did, and that these students have a chance to then go to a different college or university and pursue a quality credential or degree. For similar reasons, Pell Grant eligibility is already restored for students whose schools close before they're actually able to finish their degree or credential. Fourth recommendation is to set the lifetime limit for Pell Grants, the lifetime eligibility limit, to 7.5 years. So current federal student aid policies, they permit students to take up to 7.5 years to finish a bachelor's degree. But in 2011, there was an immediate and retroactive action and change enacted that limited Pell Grant lifetime eligibility to only 6 years, which means that Pell Grant recipients are held to a different standard than other students, and this should be reversed and made back into the 7.5-year lifetime eligibility. The fifth, and I'm almost done here, is to stop taxing Pell Grants as income. So under current law, Pell Grants are taxed as income if they're used for housing, transportation, food, and other non-tuition costs. But really, they should not be treated as taxable income as long as they're going to these qualified education expenses that we know are part of the natural cost of attending college. Not only would this help students, but it would also simplify the tax code in that sense, and it also improves coordination with the AOTC, the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And then our sixth and final recommendation is to make Pell Grants a mandatory program. This will both preserve the program and also ensure predictability. So Pell is in this really weird situation among programs, and it's a rare program that functions like an entitlement, in that every eligible student receives a grant, but it largely relies on discretionary funding. So about 80% of Pell funding is discretionary, which means that each year Congress has to allocate funds based on expected costs, estimated costs. And this means that the annual appropriated amount and the actual costs of the program each year are not perfectly aligned, which creates shortfalls in some years and surpluses in some years. And this mismatch between program design and program funding, it puts the program in jeopardy, and it generates unnecessary uncertainty both for students but also for schools. So really, by making the program mandatory, it will alleviate a lot of these concerns. So as we saw for many of us in this room, for 7.5 million Americans, the Pell Grant really is the door to opportunity to higher education. And so to secure and improve it, to make sure that we maintain this promise going forward, we really do need to move towards doubling the maximum annual award of the Pell Grant, and also tying it to inflation to ensure that it maintains its purchasing power. We also need to restore eligibility for students whose loans are discharged in fraud, set the lifetime eligibility limit to 7.5 years, stop taxing Pell as income, and make Pell a mandatory program. And I just want to end by saying Pell is so important to everything that we do at TICAS. So if any of your offices ever have any questions about this at all, please feel free to reach out to us, because we're always happy to answer questions, because it is such an important and critical program for higher education.
Thank you. All right, so as I mentioned, we're gonna hold off questions until the end, so make sure you write them down so you don't forget.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for the energy. I'm going to try to carry that on. My name is Carrie Warwick. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy with the National College Access Network. I'd like to thank TICAS for hosting this event today and for including NCAN, myself, and Cynthia as part of the discussion. I'm here today to talk about, I'm going to make sure I took some time, here today to talk about two topics in an effort to not have 10 people up here on the panelists. So I'm going to start at the beginning, which is FAFSA, and then also shift into some of the special populations conversation that Julie's going to continue and talk about immigrant students and their access or lack thereof to the Pell Grant. So for starters, the FAFSA, the free application for student aid, I'll also ask a question. Who has filled out a FAFSA themselves? So that is great. You will notice I didn't raise my hand. I am one of the, I guess, lucky ones where my mother was like, I got this, I'm not giving you the tax documents. And I was very fortunate for that, but we know for most students that is not necessarily the case, particularly for our first gen students. Cynthia told her story with the FAFSA, and NCAN has about 500 members around the country. For our direct service providing members, most of our members are nonprofit organizations who are working with low-income students, students of color, and students who are first in their family to go to college. And if there's one thing that they all have in common, it's that they help students fill out the FAFSA because we know it is such a crucial step in the financial aid process. So the FAFSA not only is the application to find out your eligibility for the Pell Grant, but it also calculates your expected family contribution, which helps colleges build your financial aid offer package, looks at whether you're eligible for subsidized federal loans, and is the form that most states use to determine the eligibility for state aid, and institutions frequently use it. In most cases, in fact, almost all institutions are using it to figure out how they're distributing institutional aid. So the FAFSA is incredibly important. It was a big step in 1992 that students didn't have to fill out a federal form, a state form, and a form for each institution. But the FAFSA has grown substantially over the years. We've made some steps forward in simplification with technology in the last decade or so, but we are still seeing great barriers in students being able to access the Pell Grant because of the complicated nature of the FAFSA form. So we know that about $2.7 billion is left on the table each year in Pell Grant dollars that currently enrolled college students would qualify for had they completed the FAFSA. So these aren't low-income students who didn't go to college because they didn't fill out the form. These are students who are in college who are somehow figuring out how to pay those bills, whether that's through private loans or working far too many hours. That these are low-income students who are somehow paying their tuition bills and their living expenses without the Pell Grant. Further, as we see from from this from these dollars left on the table that not all students are filling out the FAFSA who would be eligible, we are also looking increasingly at the FAFSA verification process. Verification is an audit-like process that federal student aid conducts in order to ensure that the information on the FAFSA is accurate and that the student is getting the aid that they are qualified for. Currently, or historically, about 30% of all FAFSA filers are selected for verification. And of Pell Grant recipients, about 50% each year of Pell eligible students are selected for the verification process. And this is where our concern of the complications of FAFSA, particularly impacting low-income students, really come to show. For Pell Grant eligible FAFSA filers who are not selected for verification, 81% of those students go on to receive a Pell Grant. That means the other 19%, for whatever reason, likely did not actually matriculate and receive financial aid. They filled out the FAFSA, but did not go to school. For Pell eligible students who were selected for verification, only 56% of those students end up receiving a Pell Grant. So we would expect that a similar percentage of those students would not go on to college for the same reasons we talk about. But there's a 25 percentage point gap between those numbers, which to us shows that there's something that we need to dive deeper into with both the FAFSA and particularly with the verification process for why this many students are not ultimately then receiving their Pell Grant award. So for that reason, NCAN strongly supports FAFSA simplification process to access the Pell Grant, particularly looking at students' financial strength. We support using means-tested benefits to award students an automatic expected family contribution of 0, which is another way of saying that if you receive a means-tested benefit, you should receive the maximum Pell Grant that you're eligible for. We believe that this would both simplify the FAFSA process for low-income students because they would not need to once again prove that they're poor. But additionally, it would create much stronger messaging around the Pell Grant program because we would be able to tell students, you receive SNAP, you receive TANF, you are eligible for this many Pell dollars. Rather than now, which is, oh, well, we know you're getting some federal benefits. If you go through this black box process, hopefully you'll get enough money for college. And then additionally, believe that we can use the tax forms to help middle income families greatly reduce their FAFSA burden by only transferring information from their taxes into the FAFSA and not asking them additional questions, and then really saving those additional complicated asset-based questions for families who are filing tax schedules, which usually signifies that they have a more complicated financial situation and most likely have assets they can use to pay for college beyond just their earnings. So obviously, this is a complicated process that can create unnecessary barriers to the Pell Grant dollars that we know that low-income students need. So I'm going to make a pivot here to the second topic about immigrant access to Pell Grants and kind of pivot on the fact that this is a very complicated process. So right now, if you are an undocumented student or if you have DACA status, you are not eligible for federal grant, for federal financial aid of any kind. Your state eligibility greatly depends on the state you're in. It can range anywhere from not being able to attend your state flagship, your state public schools, to receiving in-state tuition, to also receiving state-based financial aid. So that's very broad, and currently students who are eligible for in-state aid have to fill out a separate form if they're undocumented or receive DACA. So there's a lot of conversation about how do we help undocumented students or DACA recipients afford college. And there's a growing movement arguing that these students should have access to the Pell Grant, especially if they attended high school in the they would have all attended high school within the United States. This is something that, and in addition to FAFSA simplification and having a similar Pell proposal to the TICA's proposal, in terms of increasing FAFSA, NCAN supports the DREAM Act, which would put students on a pathway that would allow them to receive financial aid. I think the caution here in this conversation is that prior to any immigration law passage, there have been many financial aid bills that have suggested that undocumented students should be immediately eligible for federal student aid. Coming from NCAN and from wearing my practitioner hat, we're always looking at what implementation would look like on that front. So we throw up a caution just to ensure that any financial aid process that is ahead of immigration reform very closely considers how that implementation would work. And really our concern here is that, we've just outlined how the Office of Federal Student Aid struggles with verification for citizens and how that creates a great number of barriers. So we do have some concerns that federal student aid should not be put in the position of having to figure out which undocumented students should be eligible for Pell and which ones shouldn't. We would much rather see an immigration proposal that would allow students to be on a pathway to citizenship that would, by their nature of their new immigration status, make them eligible for federal student aid. And so with that, I will turn to Julie.
Sure. So thanks, Carrie, and I echo Carrie's comments. Thank you to TICAS for organizing this conversation, and thank you to all of you for coming late in the afternoon to hear what we have to say. So my name is Julia Jinka, and I'm the Vice President of Applied Research at the Institute for Higher Education Policy. You might have heard us otherwise referred to as IHA here in DC. And we're an organization that focuses on research, policy, and advocacy with the pure focus of trying to get more students to and through college in this country, with a specific focus on the country's most underserved populations. And so I am going to continue the conversation by sort of taking our attention and turning it on one particular group of students who we believe is severely underserved in this country, and that is students who are currently incarcerated. And to sort of step back, because that might be a sort of counterintuitive example for many people in this room, but to step back and understand why we consider these students some of the most underserved in the country, I think it takes understanding that, higher education does not work in a silo in this country, right? It interacts with other systems, our housing system, our healthcare system, our criminal justice system, right? Just as any of us, as we were students on or off campuses, we weren't just students, right? We had all sorts of other life responsibilities happening at the same time. And so when you think back to when the actual ban on Pell eligibility for currently incarcerated students was implemented, it was the 90s, and it was during the tough on crime era. And actually, this was not in any higher education legislation, right? This ban was ushered in through the judiciary, and it was actually put into the Violent Crimes Bill of 1994. And so what I really like to show, if I had my visuals with me today, is if you look at the 90s and you actually look at the country's violent crime rate, and then you also look at the country's state and federal prison population, you would expect maybe sort of a staggered effect, but you would expect similar trajectories, right? Because our state and federal prison populations are supposed to react to things like the crime rate in society. But what you actually see, and I'd be happy to share this with anybody offline, is complete inversion, right? And so even in 1994, we start to see a drastic decline in the country's violent crime rate, and we see an incredibly steep incline in the state and federal prison populations. So what else is happening around this time? The war on drugs is a huge, huge piece of this puzzle, because what it meant is that the current problem of mass incarceration, this crisis that we have on our hands, is largely due to the over-policing and the explosion of drug-related offenses and arrests in predominantly communities of color, right? So I say all of this to really leave you with, one large takeaway, which is that for any of us who care about equity in higher education and the hope, that Bennett really was talking about at the beginning, and that hope and opportunity being available to all people in our community, when one system systematically cuts out an entire portion of the population purely because of the communities that they grew up in, we're already admitting that the higher education system has not been set up to include certain communities. So that's just a little bit of background information on how we got to the place where we are today. So, when this ban was put into place in 1994, literally overnight, I am not exaggerating, you had hundreds of programs have to shut down in correctional facilities. They had to pack up their books the next day, and they were kicked out of facilities. Slowly over the past 2.5 decades, we've seen programs build themselves back up, largely due to private funds, some state funds as outliers, but they've slowly started to build back up. In 2015, the Obama administration, the Department of Education, used what they call the Experimental Sites Authority to run an experiment to see if they were actually able to allow higher ed institutions to use Pell funds to enroll students who are currently incarcerated. Would we see an increase in enrollment and of students' access to higher education programs? So no surprise, we have actually seen an increase enrollment. We've seen 65 institutions accepted by application offering higher ed programs in correctional facilities around the country. And that's actually just a quarter of the programs that exist right now. Right now, there are roughly over 250 credit-bearing programs. So it's happening right now, right? So why are we here talking about whether Pell should be reinstated permanently beyond this pilot program? Because we already know that it works. We know that higher education is actually, the one system that can in one generation fundamentally disrupt problems like poverty in a family. It can also fundamentally disrupt the mass incarceration cycle by reducing students' likelihood to recidivate when they return to society. But most importantly, it gives students the ability to actually harness the power of education, what I think all of us in this room have felt through personal experience, to increase their likelihood for employment, to increase the type of citizen they are in society, the leadership, the volunteerism, all of these positive impacts. We've seen it because we've seen students actually go through education and we've seen students be released. So at IHEP, we fundamentally believe that if we're going to talk about equity in higher education, that we have to understand what students have been shut out of higher education and how we can use a financial aid program like Pell to restore that opportunity to students across the country. What we do know in terms of some evidence is largely anecdotal at this point. We do have programs that are doing their best to actually collect data and use that data to improve on their programming, to figure out what kind of curriculum is really leading to good outcomes for students, what types of supports in terms of mentoring, tutoring, career readiness, the same things that we expect students to need on campuses should be held for students who are incarcerated, because it's very important to understand that we are not advocating for just sort of service projects, afterthoughts, the idea that anything is better than nothing. That is fundamentally counterproductive to opening up these educational opportunities to students. And so what we are doing at IHEP is we are trying to really build the field's capacity to actually track their own students' outcomes. We're big believers of using good data for good policy and practice. And so we are running some research with correctional facility programs led out in Indiana and in Iowa. In Indiana, there's a great partnership between the University of Notre Dame and Holy Cross College called the Moreau College Initiative. And it leads a liberal arts program in Westville Correctional Facility, about an hour outside of South Bend. And they award associates and bachelors. I was at the graduation ceremony last month, and it's a beautiful event. If any of you do have the opportunity to tour facilities, to volunteer in programs, I would certainly suggest you do. It just underscores the importance of opening up opportunities for individuals who, we call it the second chance, but let's be honest, these are plenty of individuals who were never given the first chance because they're coming from under-resourced schools, under-resourced communities, and then disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. But I'm sorry, so that is one partnership that we're working with in Indiana. And then we're working with two institutions in Iowa. One is a program between the University of Iowa and a partnering community college, and another is Iowa Central Community College. And so we are going to be testing and helping these institutions and these programs determine what indicators to collect data on. What I think we need to do a much better job of doing, and this is where we're hoping to contribute in the field as well, is, I think higher ed writ large has a challenge ahead of it to bring the argument away from just the economic imperative of education, even though it's incredibly important and we know it helped us get jobs in this room, but also trying to figure out how do we quantify and how do we describe some of these more intangible benefits around higher education that really helps us become the citizens we are, the active participants in our communities, our family members. And so we actually think for higher ed and prison programming, they these programs are doing such a good job of thinking about the moral imperative education that it could actually help us inform and revolutionize some of the discussion around what the value of higher education is, broadly speaking. And so what we do want to do in this research about what determines quality programming for students is make sure that we underscore, as policymakers are thinking about bringing back Pell eligibility, as state policymakers are thinking about open and promise programs and free college models, that again, we underscore that the quality of this education is paramount. And so in thinking through, when a student who's incarcerated doesn't have the choice to be able to choose and think about different consumer protection, guidelines that we might have had at our fingertips, that we should put in some baseline requirements to make sure that only institutions that are ready to serve their students well and then demonstrated that in the past can actually be allowed to bring programming into facilities. And so I'll end on 2 recommendations that I have been making is 1, restore Pell eligibility for currently incarcerated students. Very simple, lift the ban that was instituted in 1994. And 2, in conjunction with lifting that ban, make sure that we're paying attention to the types of institutions that we are allowing to access these federal funds, because we expect our policymakers to be responsible stewards of our taxpayer dollars. And I want my dollars going to institutions that are there to actually help students. So, thank you.
I'm like so motivated after this panel already. I was like, all right. And I'm going to excuse myself for appearing rude. I tend to ramble, so I'm gonna start this stopwatch so that I don't, keep everybody here till 7 o'clock. So if you think I'm just like looking on Instagram or whatever, I'm not. So anyway, as folks said earlier, my name is Amy Lighten. I'm the director of the Higher Education Program at New America, and I'm also a former Pell recipient. Although it was so long ago that I'm curious to see Neha's chart, that Pell paid for a lot more of my college education than it probably paid for most of the people in this room, and I'm very grateful for that. So I'm here to talk a little bit about, so I support all of these things, all of the expanding Pell in all of these ways. Some of these things are easier for Congress to get behind, and some of them are harder. But I'm here to talk about something a little bit different. I'm here to talk about something that has a lot of congressional support right now that I don't think Congress should do in terms of the Pell Grant program. and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But first, I want to get a sense of, we've all done Q&As now. How many of the people in this room either went to or are going to a 4-year institution? How many folks went to a community college? Yes, a few of us, yes. How many folks were raising dependents while you were going to college? Okay. So this is a very specific room, and DC is a very specific set of people with very specific experiences. We do not look like many and most students in higher education today. It's a very important story. All of these stories are very important, but what I want to talk about is efforts that are underway to try to expand Pell Grants to very, very, very short-term programs to try to help people, predominantly working adults, who are trying to get a leg up, who may not have time, the energy, the money, any of the resources that you need to get a 4-year degree. Because it's not 4-year degrees or bust, there are lots of alternatives. And before I sort of talk about why I'm worried about that, I want to talk a little bit about myself because, well, I can because I'm here on the panel. So, but I promise I have a reason for sort of talking about myself. I want to sort of orient myself in terms of not being a traditionalist when it comes to higher education. So I went to community college. I have spent most of my sort of federal higher education policy career focusing on the intersection of workforce and higher education. But before that, I didn't do higher education at all. I was in workforce policy and I was in labor. I worked at a labor think tank. I worked on minimum wage policy. I was a union organizer. I worked on WIOA reauthorization. Like, I've worked since I've been in the higher education space. I've worked in community college issues. I've worked on competency-based education. All of this is to sort of sort of establish my cred in terms of saying that I don't think it's four-year degrees or bust. I think there are and there should be and there must be alternatives, high quality alternatives to four-year degrees so that we can get many more people who can't do a four-year degree into good jobs, which is part of the promise of post-secondary education, right? And so all of that is to say, I believe, and yet, I am not supportive. I'm worried about efforts to increase Pell Grant funding to what are called short-term programs, but what are actually very, very, very short-term programs. So because I think there is a lot of interest in, and reasonably so, I think in creating alternatives, folks are looking for alternatives. And a lot of folks have latched onto the idea of allowing Pell to go to I'm calling them very, 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 very short-term programs. Programs as short as 8 weeks for Pell Grant programs. Yeah, folks will say, well, we need alternatives to four-year degrees. Yes, we do. And we have them. They are called 2-year programs. They're called 1-year programs. They are also called 15-week certificate programs that currently Pell will pay for. Pell Grants already go to short-term programs. There is no evidence to suggest that going to even shorter short-term programs is going to help. Now, what folks will say is rightly, look, there are some amazing, like states are doing these amazing things where they're taking, students and they're doing these HVAC programs and they're doing welding programs and they are able to quickly get into higher paying jobs. That is true, but those programs are targeted. The Pell Grant program is not targeted other than on income. It doesn't go to a specific type of program. So the proposals for short-term Pell, for example, and there are many of them, don't say, okay, programs that lead to wages in X, or programs that we know are high wage programs in 8 weeks, those can get Pell Grants. If anything, essentially, the non-credit courses that promise to be oriented around workforce programs are going to be eligible for Pell. And why this is worrying is, there are a few different ways in which this could be worrying. We could talk about, and you talked a lot about quality, which is the same issues I'm worried about with short-term Pell. You can have like a bunch of different issues. And so some people focus on, well, the actors, right? If you have bad actors, so and I'm just going to use what some people talk about, the for-profit colleges, and they get the Pell Grants, so this is going to be terrible. Okay, let's say we take the for-profit colleges out of it. Let's say every single institution that is participating is a good actor, which most colleges are, right? Most colleges, they're trying to do right by their students. It doesn't matter how well-intentioned they are, there are very few programs you can do in 8 weeks that are gonna give you middle-class jobs. If there were, we would have been doing it already and at scale. And so what I'm worried about, I think what increasing numbers of folks are worried about, is that you're going to end up tapping into a demand for very short-term programs because there is huge demand, right? Students are like, I don't have 4 years. Maybe they think, 8 weeks is the only option. In 8 weeks, I can get, an entree into the middle class. But what's gonna end up happening is you'll have a few of those programs that are gonna pay well. But for the most part, shorter-term programs don't pay well. And so what I'm worried about in particular is you're gonna see a lot of people of color and a lot of low-income folks who are really wanting that, that foothold and that acceleration. We're gonna sign up for programs because they're being offered. They're gonna take Pell, they're gonna use their Pell eligibility, and they're basically gonna be stuck in low-wage jobs. And we've seen this and folks will respond to that by saying, yes, but there's this pathway, right? So you sort of have what's called a stackable credential. You have a sort of shorter credential that will then stack and lead up to something else. For example, you could start with a certified nursing, what does CNA stand for? Certified nursing assistant, associate, assistant, thank you, whatever that is. And then theoretically, you sort of take that and then you stack it up, and at the end, you can become a nurse. And you make good money as a nurse. You don't make a lot of money as a CNA. You make not much more than minimum wage. But so while that sounds good in theory, in practice, very few people are actually stacking. And what happens is people take one bite of the apple, and more and more research is showing that people take one bite of the apple and they don't go back. So we are not only using up people's eligibility, we're basically giving them one shot that is almost guaranteed to give them low wages. So we're worried about that. And Yeah, oh my goodness, I do talk a lot, I'm glad of this. So I think the wage issue is really important, quality is really important, and again, especially as we're talking about the folks who are most, who need the help the most, right? That we don't leave them, we don't promise them something and give them something else. It's not a bait and switch, and that's what I worry about. I totally support the impulse for it, but I think there are other ways we can get there. And I'll say one other thing about that isn't as related to the folks who would be in these programs, but related to the stability of the Pell program generally, is I think Neha, you were talking about the surplus. You know, sometimes we have a surplus in Pell, sometimes we have a shortfall. When we have a shortfall, what happens is Congress starts making eligibility changes, and they start making, you have to be poorer to get Pell. You can have Pell for less time, et cetera, et cetera. Right now we're in, woohoo, we have money, so we're in a surplus. If we expand these programs that I think are disproportionately gonna put people of color into these trapped fields, and then we have a shortfall, we're gonna make those changes somewhere else. Like, we are going to end up hurting the very people who need this the most. So, all of that to say, totally support the goals. I think in terms of recommendations, I think we need to fund our workforce system. Like, we need to fund our workforce system to help people who are trying to go from unemployment to any employment. But if the promise of post-secondary education is to make you better off than if you had a high school degree, we need to make sure we're focusing on that. So if we're gonna do something in Pell, which I don't think is the right vehicle, but if so, let's do a pilot program where we look at data and we look at the wages and we figure out who's making what. Like, who is it? Are we predominantly putting, like, I worry it's mostly gonna be Black and brown women in these low-paying jobs. There are the jobs that pay off really well. There are some jobs that pay off really well. Maybe we could fund those if we sort of fully authorize. But I think we need to experiment if we're gonna do it and collect data and make sure that it's tied to high quality wages, because that's the promise and that's what we call it. So that's it.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. All right, so before we go into Q&A, I have a little assignment for you all. So talk to a neighbor for like a minute about something that surprised you throughout this panel in terms of the information that you just received. And it'll be for like a minute just to like get the energy going on, and then we'll move to Q&A. Does that sound good? Okay. Go.
Alright, now, bring it back in. Bring it in.
Alright. So, does anybody want to share something really quick before we go into Q&A? And may you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Frank Bowman, NASDAQ. Thanks for having us today, and thanks for the great list of 6 ways to increase our investment in Pell. But I always think any list should be a top 10. And so I'm going to suggest a few more. Kerry already touched on one, which is DREAM Act Aid, which 12 states now do. Amy kind of touched on one, but I'm going to take a different tack on it to say that there's millions of Americans who are 3 or 6 or 9 credits away from a degree, and a lot of them are, say, single working moms who can't get to half-time status to get Pell. So finding a solution to get them across the finish line should be probably number 8. Number 9 is we have people who have obsolete degrees, like the computer science classes I took when I was in college. The only place I can apply those skills is on a computer in the Smithsonian. So there's.
You could be an antiquities professor.
And
I say that being similarly aged.
And the last thing is Washington State has a new program where, in effect, Amazon and Microsoft and their companies agree to pay a tax because there's 7 million unfilled jobs in America. They want people with the skills to do that. So I think that is a super help. Take someone who has an associate's degree and get them to the 4-year degree that employers want. So there's my top.
I appreciate that. All right, y'all. So we're gonna move into Q&A, and also feel free to share also items that surprised you.
Hi, I'm Shekinah from the Leadership Conference. Thank you all so much for being here today. I thought it was really interesting your insight on students incarcerated right now and how we need to explain Pell Grant to them because it's a very important issue. So I just wanted to ask if you could kind of explain what oversight would look like. So you talked about making sure that we're getting our money to credible institutions so that that money isn't misused. But how would oversight look like? And would there be different or stricter standards for private prisons versus federal or public prisons?
That's a great question. And so oversight is a very serious, sort of simultaneous challenge to undertake because, when a higher ed institution decides to offer a program in a facility, it's not as though they can just sort of saunter up to the correctional facility and say, hey, we're here. And at the same time, a correctional facility, a warden can agree that this is something that he or she really wants, confined individuals to have access to. But at the same time, it's not as though higher ed institutions are sort of beating down the door. So what we do suggest is that there's an application process for this type of use of Pell funds, similar to the application process that was put in place for the Second Chance Pell pilot through the Department of Education. And the purpose of that is because you want to collect at the beginning and the outset very clear intention between higher ed and corrections, that they're going to work together, because this cannot operate with just one sector doing this alone. I mean, obviously, with most facilities banning even internet access, you're gonna have to think about how to make your curricular delivery and curricular content equitable. And so you will have to think about how you adjust it. You're gonna have to think about space and other types of, sort of question mark, different individual circumstances that correctional facilities will necessarily need. Higher ed, and we know it, has to sort of adjust and change. Just as higher ed has evolved and changed for different student populations, meeting different student needs, I think meeting the needs of student parents, these sorts of circumstances, just realizing that these are today's students. So I think in terms of oversight, we would be looking to a very deliberate partnership that we would have oversight of corrections and higher ed and who they're allowed to let in.
Thank you. Let's go here and then we'll go to the back. Hi, thank you so much. So I have a clarification question on your discussion of the barriers that the FAFSA application poses to receiving Pell Grants. If you could speak a little bit more about action items, actionable recommendations you have to streamline and improve that process, so we see less of those withdrawing statistics that you're rattling off. I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure, happy to go into our recommendations in more detail. NCAN has a proposal for FAFSA simplification that is focused on what we call the three pathway approach, where basically you would look at a family's financial strength, whether it's an independent student or a dependent student and their parents, and based on their financial strength would depend on how many questions they would need to answer to complete the FAFSA. So if you are into the question count, if you've seen, I know we're on the other side of the hill, but if you've seen Senator Alexander unroll the paper FAFSA, if you count the questions on the paper FAFSA and all of the subparts, it's 142. Fewer than 1% of FAFSA filers fill out the paper form. It makes for a very dramatic prop, but most students are doing it online. And if you're doing it online, we have an increasingly sophisticated FAFSA application that uses skip logic, so that depending on the type of FAFSA filer depends on which questions you answer. So for example, if you answer the gender question as female, you're not going to get a question about selective service. That's a fairly simple example, but there are more complicated ones when it comes to the financial questions as well. But we are, still seeing that that many of the financial questions, particularly a group of about 25 to 30 questions, have a non-zero response from less than 1% of the filers. So we don't think it's necessary to ask most filers these questions. And additionally, additionally for low-income students, since many of their families are already receiving means-tested benefits, we feel that they've already proved to the federal government that they're poor, and that they shouldn't have to jump through these hoops again. So we would divide filers into three groups. For students who have families who are receiving means-tested benefits, they would answer the means-tested. We would put the means-tested benefit question up front. If you receive a means-tested benefit, you would automatically get a 0 EFC. You would not have to answer other financial questions. For middle-income families who aren't receiving means-tested benefits, but who do not have more complicated situations, they're basically middle class, they're living on the income they earn, maybe they have some basic savings. We would suggest that they are able to use the IRS data retrieval tool to bring their tax information over and answer probably 0 to a handful of additional questions that aren't available through the IRS data retrieval tool. As part of that, we'd also like to see an expansion in the partnership between the Department of Education and Treasury through changes in the Internal Revenue Code that would allow all FAFSA filers to access the data retrieval tool. Currently, only you have to be either a single individual tax filer or married filing jointly. If you're married filing separately or head of household, you're not eligible to use the data retrieval tool, or if you're very low income and you're a non-tax filer, you're not eligible to use the data retrieval tool. Those changes would allow everyone to have that access. And then finally, for our higher income families who are using tax schedules, we would recommend some additional asset questions for those. So I will be honest, right now we're diving into whether the new tax forms trigger in the same way the old tax forms do. We believe that they might, but there might be some exceptions. So this proposal was developed under the old tax form, so that's something we're diving into right now. But generally, if your family is filling out either the additional Schedule 1 now or in the old tax forms, in the FAFSA we're currently using, they're still using old tax forms, the 1040 long form, That usually signifies that there are some assets either from business, from significant mortgage deductions or other types of investments. And those are the types of questions where institutions say, we really need that additional information to parse out how we're using our institutional aid. So that's why we feel that we should ask those questions of our higher income families who likely have assets to pay for college beyond just what you're going to see on their W-2 earnings.
And that's a question in the back.
So, Carrie, I was just, as you know, we were the long-term residents of the United States. So I was just a little bit surprised by your comment. As you know, Immigrant rights groups have been fighting for pathway citizenship for Dreamers, but in many states. They've also been fighting for in-state tuition and also access to state aid. And so I guess I'm most confused by your comment, because from my stand, from the anti-poverty organization, we would want Dreamers to be treated like legal permanent residents and to have access to federal student aid. I understand the bureaucratic mechanisms that you described, but I don't know if other groups would necessarily agree with some of you. Could you just say more about that?
Sure. So to be clear, we support a pathway to citizenship. We think that should include financial aid. We think it should be done through immigration legislation that puts the onus on the Department of Homeland Security to figure out who qualifies to be on that pathway. If we do it through higher education legislation before the immigration solution, I think we have to be very careful as to who then decides who is eligible. So I've read many bills or drafts of bills that say we want Dreamers to be eligible for financial aid, and they have to, similar to the DACA application, have been in the country on this day, and they have to have been here continuously for 5 years, and they have, and so there's a long checklist that they have to qualify for. And so if you plug that into that checklist into the FAFSA, we think that those students will almost all be selected for verification, and then it will be put on the financial aid officers at the institutions to determine whether or not a student is eligible based on their immigration history. And that is a system that we just don't see as actually working in favor of students. So we would like there to be in that, if the financial aid legislation is going to be passed prior to immigration reform, I have not yet seen a solution that figures out which Dreamers are eligible for aid without putting the onus on financial aid administrators. And so I'm open to ideas. I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, but it's just something that we're flagging, that if you're going to say Dreamers are eligible for financial aid, even though we haven't solved the immigration, even though we haven't set up a pathway for them in immigration yet, then and that's going to be a subset of Dreamers, who then determines which of those Dreamers are eligible and goes through that process. And we just have a lot of questions about the way we've seen that written in the bills that have been released so far because of who makes those decisions.
Cool. We'll go here and over here and then in the back.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that question, because representing the 12 states that have need-based aid programs for Dreamers, part of the reason I thought Carrie said we need to fix the immigration solution first is in the last 2 years, the number of people applying for Dreamer aid has declined, in some cases by a lot. And part of the issue is that students are concerned that their parents' information will be taken from that application, and that will go to ICE and will be deported. So a lot of states have spent a lot of money to make students and parents understand we will die before we give the information to ICE. But I wouldn't want to be the Dreamer applying in this administration for federal aid and be comfortable that wasn't going to be used for a very bad purpose. So I think that is part of why Carrie is saying you need to fix immigration first.
Thanks, Frank.
If the Bureau at sites are students without high school diplomas and GED equivalents eligible to participate?
So you have.
If they are, can they receive funding through ability to benefit?
So you have to be, and actually Carrie, who's in the audience, was part of some of the the Second Chance Pell pilot program criteria, but my understanding is that you are only eligible for the funds if you are otherwise Pell eligible, so you have had to have completed GED, and you cannot use those funds for non-credit bearing courses at the secondary level.
And there was a question in the back.
Well, I think it's not my concern, but let's say colleagues tomorrow decides to extend DACA, to allow DACA students to receive Pell Grants. Do you have any ideas or recommendations on prevent or like obstruct information exchanges between the Department of Education, universities, and INS and ICE? Do you have any ideas on how to prevent those exchanges?
To prevent the sharing.
The sharing information, does this provide the database to immigration agencies, but are you aware of any statutes that prevent information sharing?
So statutes, no. I think to clarify my comments, I think there's a difference between DACA and Dreamers who are still undocumented. If you're DACA, the federal government already knows who you are. DHS has all of your information, but you have legal status to be here. And so one of the solutions that we have discussed internally is to say, well, let's give DACA recipients eligible to Pell Grants, because then financial aid administrators only need to confirm that they have DACA. They don't need to go through that whole checklist. They can just say, we have DACA. And so that's actually something we have not officially put on our policy agenda. So, but something that to me personally makes sense. The challenge with that is that particularly for our population of students who are in high school, is that fewer and fewer of them have DACA because fewer and fewer of them were old enough to apply for DACA when new applications were being accepted. So that's a good solution for 20-somethings, 30-somethings who qualified for DACA, applied for it during the Obama administration, and but just never haven't gone to school yet. So that because they weren't able to pay, to find enough financial aid, given that they don't have federal eligibility. So if they have DACA, that's kind of one group of students. That's something that would be easier for us to say, okay, give DACA recipients federal aid, and then financial aid officers can just say, confirm that they have DACA. And as for sharing, generally agencies aren't good at cross-agency information sharing. We actually spend a lot of time encouraging agencies to share information when it comes to Treasury and the Department of Ed. It's not something that they do. The Department of Education has, to my knowledge, never shared over to DHS or really to any other agency, for any negative purposes. However, I don't, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure there are experts on this room beyond me, but we tell our students who are concerned, particularly our students who are citizens but have undocumented parents and have to fill out the FAFSA, putting all zeros in for their social security numbers. We tell them the Department of Education has never shared immigration status, with ICE. We don't think they're going to, but we cannot tell you that they won't. So that's, so that is something I think that Frank is right, that we're seeing a growing number of students who have mixed status families who qualify to fill out the FAFSA and don't want to. So, that's just another reason why we would like to see the immigration solutions first, to make sure that, that everyone feels safe and that it's done well. Did that answer your question?
Well, sure, there might be like a kind of morass, but my concern is just raised that, mixed status families or students who reside with mixed status families are concerned about sharing the data, and especially under the Trump administration, which is really adamant. For example, the President Trump has delayed the immigration rates for 2 weeks until Congress comes with some solution. So even though the Department of Education has not, as Secretary DeVos, President Trump, or whoever with the immigration issues might coordinate to do that, since the administration has been adamant to do so. So that's my particular concern, which I think is admirable, but a concern obviously is like privacy issues and giving that new database to President DeVos and President Trump and their agency heads.
Well, Secretary DeVos, just to be clear, does have control of the Office of Federal Student Aid database. So theoretically, the Department of Education has the information of any undocumented parents who have citizen children. They don't use it for anything other than financial aid. The Higher Education Act says you can only use FAFSA to determine financial aid. But I don't know I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if that's strong enough. I don't know if that's a strong enough precedent to prevent them from sharing it with another agency for another purpose, even though it says that they're not supposed to. Yes, that's the statute, sorry.
We have three more questions. I saw this back and then we'll go with you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley. I'm in the Immigrant Foundation. I have a question for Amy Fafsa from Pell. I was wondering, I know you said that you were worried that a disproportionate of Black and brown women kind of funneled into these short-term programs. What is the data? Is there any data on currently who's accessing these short-term programs, what their outcomes are?
Oh my gosh, your team is up so well because I think TICAS is coming out with a report on this shortly, right?
This month,
This month.
it's almost like we planted you.
Wait, so can I, well, no, you go, because you wrote.
I did not write
You
it.
didn't write it, but you read the report.
I can tell you a little bit about the report. There isn't a lot of great data out there, which is basically what this report is gonna say, is that we have this we have this concept of short-term health programs, or short-term programs, but what that actually means varies a lot from place to place. And so we go into 4 different states, a lot into the data there, and we talk about all these different definitions that are used and how there isn't a lot of great data. And we can also send around a link also as well at the end of this, but yeah, that should be out towards the end of this month. And I'm happy to connect you to the authors of that report who can tell you a lot more than I can.
But I would say generally,
I'm gonna jump in on that.
yes, you can.
Most states don't collect demographic data, but it does appear that there's huge variations in that program. And not surprisingly, students of color and women are not in the highest paid group.
And I would say even before, we're going to have the TICAS report that basically says, we don't know a lot of things yet. So it seems crazy to me that we would be doing federal policy when we don't really know. And what we do know, it doesn't look pretty, but we do know from gainful employment that we have looked at shorter, in general, the shorter the program is, the lower the wages and the worse the outcomes. Like, again, there are some variations, but that's with programs, like a lot of programs that are a year compared to 4 years or 2 years, or 15 weeks, some of them, we don't even have data on, like 8-week programs. So, but it seems intuitive to me to think that, like, if you are going on a downward trajectory, like you get a 4-year degree, you make a certain amount, you make less as you get 2 years, you make less as 1 year, then less as you get 15-week certificate. It seems unlikely to me there's gonna be a huge bump up if you go to 8 weeks. But all the more reason for us to have better data generally on outcomes for everybody, for all students, but particularly we're promising folks this sort of on-ramp that's like quick road to better wages. We should know what those are.
Good afternoon, I'm Ruben Austin, policy fellow for Mr. Clyburn. I have a quick question about restoring the eligibility specifically for currently incarcerated students. Do you anticipate that facilities will then place their specific restrictions on what kind of incarcerated individuals can participate in these programs? And if so, do you have any ideas on how to combat that? And then secondly, just a quick clarification, do you also have in mind that juvenile facilities will be able to participate in this, considering that they often house folks until they're in their low 20s?
Sure. Okay. So I'll just do this in reverse order. But under the last administration, there was actually guidance put out that clarified that this Pell ban is actually only for state and federal penal institutions and not juvenile facilities. So they can actually still qualify for Pell. Now, going back to your first question, also an excellent question, and something that we have really been encouraging folks to allow corrections to actually allow corrections to devise their own student eligibility requirements instead of blanket restrictions like, eventual release or things like that requires. Because correctional stakeholders, local leaders, stakeholders, they know their context, they know the needs of their facility much better than any federal policymakers would be able able to. And so you'll actually see, later on this week, the Association of State Correctional Administrators, ASCA, will be in town actually talking about the importance of opening up facilities to educational programming. And so you'll hear wardens and commissioners repeatedly say that they see the benefit of this programming for everyone in their facilities, because they are actually right now in controlled facilities where lifers are in programs. And so even if some people are predisposed to think of higher ed and prison programs as leading to greater public safety through reducing recidivism or greater workforce development, what we are actually seeing is for students who will never be released, there are still very tangible positive benefits of this programming, and the correctional stakeholders themselves say it changes the culture of a facility. You see violence go down the facility, you see trust between correctional officers and incarcerated individuals go up. So this is really just a no-brainer, but we want correctional stakeholders to have the discretion to allow who they want into programs.
All right, so we have room for one question, if somebody has a question.
Hi. I have a question, I guess it's for Tika, so thank you for outlining these Pell recommendations, especially the one about the Pell Grant as income is a big learning point. So as a student serving organization, it's really helpful. I'm curious if you could talk more about the mandatory programs and what are the political trade-offs there? Why is it not already mandatory, and why that recommendation given the context?
Right, so it ends up being a complicated thing to do, just because you need alignment between appropriations, so like the budget subcommittees and the authorizers, so the policy committees. And so that's just like a hard thing to get from time to time. And there are a lot of nobody likes giving up discretionary ability. So when you have control, as a policymaker, if you have the discretion to choose, this is what's going to happen with the program year after year, like giving up that is always something that's hard to go in that direction. So it's a combination of just it being a more complicated thing to actually enact because you need that alignment between different folks, but also just the natural tendency that if you have discretionary power, you're not going to want to give that up naturally. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, y'all. So thank you all so much for participating. Before you go, I want to turn off to James and also to the students if you all want to say anything and just ground all of us.
Why don't you guys go first? Closing thoughts.
First, just thank you all again for coming and listening, hearing our stories and hearing the experts speak, of course. It's just nice to see some people turning out and actually thinking about the issue and being willing to move forward on it. So we appreciate it.
Another round. Thank you for bearing with us. We covered a lot of ground. It was 90 minutes. Please feel free to follow up with us. I'm happy to talk about this more now or in the future. Grab me, grab Neha. Michelle is there. Connie's in the back of the room. We can connect you with the panelists and their expertise too. So thanks again. Thank you for coming.
That's so awesome. I think that I don't know. I love it so much. I would love for it to be it just seems so fulfilling.